countries and others. But they all agreed on the basis of Darfur, of the Rwanda genocide, of the events in the Balkans. They all agreed that for the first time the international community had a responsibility to protect citizens in another country. The first time that the wall of sovereignty erected in 1848 was broken and chipped back a little bit. Now that says to me that there is a broad awareness and support among both the Western nations and the United States and other countries of the necessity of trying to intervene and rescue people who are in dire need or whose entire civilizations are at risk. That would be one view of an optimist. A second view would be the satellite bouquets. And when I say satellite bouquets, I mean I was driving with a chap who has the XM radio, and he had subscribed to a service of international stations. And in the space of 24 hours, he could hear all of these different viewpoints and the programming of all of them and arrive at his own conclusions, weigh one aspect against another aspect, one viewpoint against another viewpoint. It seems to me that technology, along with a growing awareness of the world on the part of many people, and those who are subscribing online, and as mentioned earlier, the SMSs and the podcasts and YouTube even, although I say that with some reservation because it's not altogether public good, but all of that is creating a more informed world. And as the world becomes more informed, I think people will be arriving at conclusions based on more sources. And I think the trajectory is only higher than it was 10 years ago. And I imagine in Russia even that could be a factor, although Russia is tightening up the flows of information into the country. I can't believe that somehow, as the street demonstrations of late have shown, that there is a latent desire not to leave the world entirely, despite the authoritarian, increasingly authoritarian Kremlin that we see today.
Mr. Heil, your optimism is quite contagious, and I feel optimist also. But my sense is that the basis of this optimism are rather too vague and general. What she said, Ms. Dubinsky said, and what you said, I think, needs a little more reflection and a little meta-analysis. Ms. Dubinsky said the idea not to intervene. And then she said they need our help. And what you had said, the world community had decided not to leave it open. I think there is a general agreement, and there have been, I think, some Harvard scholars who have said we need to redefine the notion of the state in the 21st century. No state should be allowed to do two things: to oppress its own people and start a war against others. I'm all for that. But the point that Ms. Dubinsky made, and I'm not dismissing it, and yet I think it needs further discussion, when we say a country like Russia needs foreign intervention for the inculcation of democracy, then we cannot but compare it with Iraq, what happened there, inculcation of democracy by force. So there are very serious consequences of these ideas. It is the whole question of ends and means. Not only the ends have to be democratic and peaceful and based on the consent of the governed, the means also have to be the same thing. So when we say we will not allow, for instance, none other than Henry Kissinger in his book, Does America Need a Foreign Policy, has said, U.S. should not submit itself to the universal jurisdiction of the international law, criminal court, international court. So then we are saying everybody else will be subject to that kind of intervention except us. Two problems. One of double standards, and second is the issue of where you go into countries and reorder their systems against their will or at a rate that they are not ready for. And I think there are consequences for that. Then what results is not democracy or liberation. It results in occupation, interference, and further polarization of the world. How do we deal with that? And what's the role of the media in the middle of this thing? Because media has to take a position on this approach.
Well, I think media, if it's the kind of media that many of us idealize on this panel, will be a media that will be critical of the United States, will be critical of its double standard in this case, and allow people to arrive at their own conclusions eventually. The pendulum will swing, and the United States, as we see now, really, I think I can say in the debate on the environment and global warming, you see a real sea change in the United States in viewing that, at least in the public mind as well as in the official mind.
On that critical and positive note, let's take a break. We'll be back after a brief intermission. Thank you. Ms. Delinda Hanley, you have a unique perspective on news within the United States. You have a small publication that speaks unofficial truths. Tell us, what's your experience and what can we learn from your experience?
I am very worried about our U.S. media. I see the media becoming tabloid news hype and not talking about important things like Dr. Samuel Arian's arrest and all the things that really matter to our human rights in this country. And I'm very concerned unless newspapers and magazines are allowed to talk about these things, and the television is just, it's turning into tabloid television instead. So I'm more worried about U.S. media than I am about international media. I think when I travel, I see people overseas know so much more about our politics than Americans know. I think we have a very informed global community, and we have to work on this community in the United States.
And I think partly that can be just very quickly reviewed by looking at the format of international news on ABC or CBS or CNN, and we can see how much general international news is there. But let's end it on a positive note, because that's the end result we want. We'll start just any direction. Anybody can jump in. You know, what is the shape of news we see in one generation, 25 years? And what do you think will be the nature of flow of information globally, in your judgment? Anybody?
See, it all depends. Like today, as you say, 25 years on, the world is a changed platform. And we call it a global village. Today, I feel that the media, if it has to play an important role, it can certainly play an important role by being absolutely targetive. And by that, I mean, for example, they have to go after policymakers. The actual policymakers. I mean, for example, one Mr. Wolfowitz, who's deemed to be seen as the architect of the Iraq War. I mean, if somebody had just targeted him and started putting questions to him, to his mind,